What if I told you that the most devastating weapon in human history was dropped on a city full of people who had no idea what was coming? Not in a war movie, not in a thriller, but in real life, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. The sun is rising. A baker opens his shop. Children walk to school. A nurse clocks in for her morning shift. The city is alive, loud, and utterly unaware. High above, at 31,000 feet, a lone American bomber cuts silently through the clouds. Inside it sits a single bomb. It weighs 9,700 pounds. It has a nickname, Little Boy. And in less than 15 seconds, it will erase 80,000 people from the face of the earth. This is not just the story of a bomb. This is the story of how the world arrived at that moment, and why the men who made the decision never lost a night's sleep over it. Stay with me, because what happened in those final days of World War II will change how you think about power, war, and the price of victory forever. To understand why 2 Japanese cities were vaporized in 3 days, we have to go back 6 years, to the moment the modern world cracked open. September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. Within hours, the dominoes fall. Britain and France declare war on Germany. The Second World War has begun. The planet splits into 2 camps. On one side, the Axis powers, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, Fascist Italy under Mussolini, and Imperial Japan. On the other, the Allied powers, Britain, France, and eventually the Soviet Union. America, for now, stays out. But it doesn't stay neutral. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the U.S. passes the Lend-Lease Act, quietly funneling weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the Allies. The stage is being set, even if the curtain hasn't risen yet. Meanwhile, Hitler's war machine rolls across Europe. Poland falls. France falls. Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, all fall. The swastika flies over half a continent, and far to the east, Japan has its own ambitions. While Europe burned under Hitler's orders, Japan was building its own empire, one brutal conquest at a time. Emperor Hirohito sat at the throne. He dreamed of what Japanese leaders called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision of Asia united under Japanese leadership. In practice, it meant Japan's military machines swallowing its neighbors whole. Korea, Taiwan, parts of China, Cambodia, Vietnam, all fell under Japanese control. The conquests were often savage. In Nanking, China, Japanese soldiers committed massacres that shocked the world. But Japan had a problem that no amount of military victories could solve: natural resources. Japan was an island nation with almost no oil, and more than 80% of its fuel came from one place, the United States of America. Washington watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. Warnings were issued. Japan ignored them. And then America made its move. First, the U.S. froze all Japanese assets in America. Then it cut off trade entirely. Finally, working with Britain and the Dutch, Washington imposed a full oil embargo on Japan. The fuel stopped flowing. The clock started ticking. Japan had maybe 18 months of oil reserves left. After that, collapse. So Japan made a desperate gamble. Japan's military planners knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Japan was going to seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaya, the Philippines, it had to first destroy the only force powerful enough to stop it: the United States Pacific Fleet. December 7th, 1941, 7:48 in the morning, Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Without warning, without a declaration of war, 353 Japanese aircraft sweep out of the sky and tear the U.S. naval base apart. Battleships explode. Planes burn on runways before they can even take off. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans are dead. 20 naval vessels are destroyed or crippled. 300 aircraft are gone. President Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and it was furious. The consequences would reshape the entire planet. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan moved with terrifying speed. Guam fell. Wake Island fell. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, fell. The Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all fell. By early 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. It seemed unstoppable. But momentum is a fragile thing in war. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 proved to be the turning point. American naval intelligence had cracked Japan's codes. They knew where Japan's fleet was going. In 4 days of fighting, the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the backbone of Japan's naval power. Japan never fully recovered. What followed were 2 more years of brutal island-hopping campaigns. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, each island taken at a horrifying cost on both sides. And through it all, Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that stunned American commanders. Surrender was not in their vocabulary. Death before dishonor was not a slogan. It was a way of life. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. Hitler was dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. Germany would surrender in May. But in the Pacific, the killing continued. April 1945. The Battle of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. American forces stormed the island just 340 miles south of the Japanese mainland. What they encounter changes everything the U.S. military thinks it knows about invading Japan. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan militia fight to the last man. Kamikazes, suicide pilots, sink dozens of American ships. After 82 days of combat, the island is secured, but the cost is catastrophic. Over 12,000 American soldiers dead, nearly 36,000 wounded. On the Japanese side, over 100,000 military dead, and somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire. American military planners sat with those numbers and did the math. If Okinawa cost this much, and it was one island, what would it cost to invade the Japanese mainland? Their estimates were staggering. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was projected to result in up to 1 million American casualties and millions more Japanese, both soldiers and civilians. Someone had to find another way. Deep in the deserts of New Mexico, in the mountains of Tennessee, and on the banks of the Columbia River in Washington State, something extraordinary was happening. Something so secret that most of the 130,000 people working on it didn't know what they were actually building. It was called the Manhattan Project. The idea had roots in terror. In 1939, a letter signed by Albert Einstein and written largely by physicist Leo Szilard landed on President Roosevelt's desk. It warned that Germany might be developing a nuclear weapon. If Hitler got the bomb first, the consequences were unthinkable. Roosevelt authorized the project. Over the next 6 years, the U.S. government poured roughly $2 billion, the equivalent of over $30 billion today, into a single goal: build a weapon powered by atomic fission before anyone else. The scientific director was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant and complicated physicist from New York. The military overseer was General Leslie Groves, methodical, relentless, and completely convinced of the project's necessity. Together, they assembled the greatest concentration of scientific talent in history. Nobel laureates worked alongside young graduate students. Engineers built entire secret cities. Families moved without being told where they were going or why. And by the summer of 1945, they had it. July 16th, 1945, 5:29 in the morning. The Jornada del Muerto Desert, New Mexico. The name of the place translates from Spanish as Journey of the Dead Man. A steel tower stands in the pre-dawn darkness. On top of it rests a device that scientists have nicknamed the Gadget. What happens next will change the course of human civilization. At exactly 5:29 a.m., the world's first nuclear weapon detonates. The flash is visible from 160 miles away, brighter than the sun. A shockwave knocks observers off their feet 10 miles from the blast. A mushroom cloud rises 40,000 feet into the sky. The tower evaporates. The sand beneath it turns to green glass. Robert Oppenheimer watches in silence. Later, he recalls a line from the ancient Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test is a complete success. The Trinity device yields roughly 21 kilotons of explosive force, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. America now has the most destructive weapon ever created. The question is whether and how to use it. Harry S. Truman had been president for less than 4 months when he learned about the Manhattan Project. Roosevelt had never told him. The vice president, one heartbeat from the presidency, had been kept in the dark. Now the weight of it all landed on Truman's shoulders at once. A war he had inherited, a weapon of unimaginable power, and a Japan that refused to quit. His advisors laid out the options. Option 1. A conventional invasion of the Japanese mainland. Cost, potentially 1 million American lives and millions of Japanese. Timeline, 18 months to 2 years minimum. Option 2. Continue the firebombing campaign already devastating Japanese cities. Effective, but slow, and Japan showed no signs of breaking. Option 3. A naval blockade and siege. Japan would eventually starve into submission, but it could take years, and millions of Japanese civilians would die of famine. Option 4. Demonstrate the atomic bomb on an uninhabited target, then threaten Japan. Advisors worried Japan still wouldn't surrender, and America only had 2 bombs ready. Option 5. Use the bomb directly on Japanese cities. Truman chose option 5. But his decision was not made in a vacuum. It was shaped by something else entirely: the shadow of the Soviet Union. In July 1945, the Allied leaders gathered at Potsdam, Germany, for what would be one of the last great wartime conferences. Truman, Churchill, Stalin, the Big Three, though the chemistry between them had changed. At Potsdam, Truman casually mentioned to Stalin that America had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin barely reacted. Unknown to Truman, Soviet spies had already informed Stalin about the Manhattan Project months earlier. The real message at Potsdam was directed at Japan. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26, 1945, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan's military government, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, met to discuss the ultimatum. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki announced publicly that Japan would treat the declaration with silent contempt. The exact meaning was ambiguous, but in Washington it was read as rejection. The decision was final. The bombers were already being prepared. Japan had no idea what was coming. America had tested only 1 bomb, but it had 2 more ready to deploy. August 6, 1945. 2:45 in the morning, Tinian Island, Northern Mariana Islands. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, rolls down the runway and lifts into the Pacific night. In its bomb bay hangs Little Boy, a uranium-235 gun-type fission device 10 feet long, weighing nearly 5 tons. At 7:09 a.m., a weather reconnaissance plane radios ahead. Cloud cover less than 3/10. Advice: bomb primary. Primary target confirmed: Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the bomb bay doors open. Little Boy drops free. For 44.4 seconds, it falls. At 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, directly below, the device detonates. The fireball reaches a temperature of 7,000 degrees Celsius in less than 1 second. A shock wave expands outward at nearly 1,000 miles per hour. Within 2 miles of the blast, every building collapses. Every person without shelter dies instantly or within hours. The mushroom cloud rises to 40,000 feet. Seen from the Enola Gay, the city below disappears under a boiling mass of smoke and fire. Tail Gunner Sergeant Bob Karen looks back at what was once a city of 350,000 people. He later said it looked like the surface of a boiling black oil. In the first seconds, approximately 80,000 dead,
In the days and months that follow from radiation sickness and burns, the toll climbs past 140,000. On the walls of buildings near Ground Zero, investigators later find dark shadows burned into stone, the outlines of people who simply ceased to exist.
Washington waited. Surely now Japan would break. It didn't. Japan's Supreme War Council convened to discuss Hiroshima. Hardline military officers argued that the bomb was a one-time weapon, that America couldn't possibly have another. They urged continued resistance. Their plan was to fight so ferociously on the beaches that the Allies would agree to a negotiated peace. Meanwhile, Japan's foreign ministry was quietly reaching out to the Soviet Union, hoping Moscow could broker a face-saving deal. Japan didn't yet know that the Soviets had already secretly agreed with America and Britain to enter the Pacific War. On August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Japanese-controlled Manchuria. 1 million Soviet troops steamrolled through Japanese lines. In 48 hours, Japan had been hit with the world's most destructive bomb and had its last potential lifeline, Soviet mediation, severed. Still, the hardliners held firm. So America did the unthinkable. 3 days after Hiroshima, they dropped another bomb. The second bomb was different from the first. Little Boy had used uranium-235. The new device, codenamed Fat Man, used plutonium, and it was more powerful. The primary target that morning was Kokura, but when Major Charles Sweeney's B-29 boxcar arrived over the city, heavy smoke and cloud cover obscured the target. 3 passes, no clear view, fuel running critically low. The backup target, Nagasaki. August 9, 1945, 11:02 a.m. Boxcar arrives over Nagasaki, a city built in 2 coastal valleys divided by steep hills. The geography that makes Nagasaki beautiful also limits the bomb's reach. A break appears in the clouds. Fat Man drops. It detonates at 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley in the northwestern part of the city. The yield? 21 kilotons, more powerful than Hiroshima. The hills contain the blast in one direction, sparing the city center, but the Urakami district, home to Japan's largest Catholic cathedral, is obliterated. Approximately 40,000 people die instantly. By the end of 1945, the total death toll from Nagasaki reaches between 60,000 and 80,000. Japan now knew America had more than one bomb, and there was no end in sight. For Emperor Hirohito, the calculus had changed. Japan's military had promised that any Allied invasion of the home islands would be met with 10 million armed civilians and the entire remaining military. The plan had a name: Operation Ketsugo. Its logic was that Japan could make the cost of invasion so catastrophically high that America would agree to a negotiated peace. But 2 atomic bombs in 3 days and the Soviet entry into the war destroyed that calculation entirely. There was no longer any hope of a negotiated peace. On August 10th, Japan's government sent word through neutral Switzerland. Japan would accept the Potsdam terms on one condition: Emperor Hirohito must be allowed to remain as a symbolic head of state. After tense negotiations, the Allies agreed, with conditions. Hirohito would remain emperor, but all real power would transfer to Allied command. The emperor would not stand trial for war crimes. A group of junior military officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender, storming the imperial palace to destroy the recording of Hirohito's surrender speech. They failed. On August 15, 1945, for the first time in Japanese history, the emperor addressed his people directly by radio. His voice, which most Japanese had never heard, delivered words that ended an era. We must endure the unendurable. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. It took 11 minutes. The bombs worked. Japan surrendered. The war ended. And for decades, that logic dominated the conversation. The atomic bombings saved lives. American lives, Japanese lives, by ending the war faster than any invasion could have. But the debate never truly ended. Historians, military analysts, and survivors have argued for 80 years about whether those two bombs were a military necessity or a political statement. Were they really about ending the war with Japan, or sending a message to the Soviet Union? Was Japan on the verge of surrender anyway? Could a demonstration on an uninhabited island have worked? There are no clean answers, only the weight of history. In Hiroshima today, the atomic bomb dome stands as it was left, a skeletal ruin deliberately preserved as a monument to what happened beneath it. Every year on August 6th, the city observes a moment of silence at exactly 8:15 a.m. The shadow of a person burned into stone steps near the Sumitomo Bank in Hiroshima, now called the human shadow of death, remains one of the most haunting images in modern history. Robert Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life wrestling with what he had built. He later said, "The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." Harry Truman never publicly expressed regret. He maintained until his death that the bombs were necessary and that he made the right call. The world that emerged from August 1945 has lived under the shadow of the mushroom cloud ever since. 9 nations now have nuclear weapons. The arsenals they hold could end human civilization dozens of times over. And yet, as of today, no nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not a story about the past. It is a warning about the present and a responsibility for the future. It is a reminder of what happens when nations play with fire they don't fully understand, and what happens to the innocent people who never chose to play at all. If this documentary opened your eyes to a chapter of history that deserves to be remembered, not just as dates and numbers, but as human lives, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Every week we go deep into the stories that shape the world we live in today. Hit the like button if this video made you think. Drop a comment below. I want to know, do you think Truman made the right decision? There's no wrong answer. This is history. It's complicated, and it deserves a real conversation. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking
Why?